The sun was just rising over Wagadugu when Captain Ibrahim Traoré received the call. It was from an international media powerhouse, World Vision Live, a channel watched by over 100 million people worldwide. They were hosting a historic debate, the future of U.S.-Africa relations. On the panel, President Donald Trump, EU officials, and they wanted Ibrahim Traoré. Traoré hesitated. He wasn't one for flashy studios or pointless arguments. But his advisor leaned in and said, "This is your chance to speak for Africa." Traoré agreed, on one condition. "If I come, I speak freely. No edits, no filters." They agreed. Meanwhile, in New York, Donald Trump prepared too. He was excited. To him, Africa was still a place to manage. He told his team with a grin, "This African kid doesn't know what's coming." What none of them knew was that this debate wouldn't be normal. It would become a global earthquake. And it would begin with one sentence that shocked the planet. World Vision Live was electric. The studio pulsed with blue and red LED lights. Reporters ran back and forth. Millions of people were tuning in from every corner of the world: Nigeria, Burkina Faso, France, Kenya, the US. Inside the glass studio, 6 panelists sat at a sleek, curved table. Joe Biden nodded politely. European leaders smiled stiffly. Donald Trump sat with a smug grin, adjusting his tie. He barely looked at anyone, until the screen behind them lit up. Joining us live from Wagadugu, Captain Ibrahim Traoré. The crowd watching in Times Square cheered. The camera panned to Traoré's face, calm, focused, dressed in his green uniform. He didn't smile. He simply said, "Thank you for inviting me." The host began softly. "Captain Traoré, what's your vision for Africa?" Traoré's voice was even. "Self-respect, independence, dignity, no begging." Trump rolled his eyes. He chuckled into the mic. "Sounds like someone's been reading fairy tales." Traoré looked up at him. His words were steady, but his eyes were sharp. "We don't need fairy tales, Mr. Trump. We need fairness." A pause. The audience held its breath, and then Trump lost it. Trump slammed his hand on the table. "Sit down, you son of a bitch," he shouted, voice thundering across the studio. Silence. Everyone froze. The anchors, the audience, the cameramen. A woman in the front row gasped. One of the studio producers whispered, "Cut the feed?" But the director shook his head. "No, the world needs to see this." Traoré's screen didn't blink. He didn't look angry. He didn't flinch. But his eyes, they locked onto Trump with the kind of calm that made the whole world pause. Traoré leaned forward, slowly, quietly, and then, in a voice that cut through the noise like a blade, he said, "You may have money, Mr. Trump. You may have cameras, but you have no soul." The studio gasped. A tear rolled down the cheek of an African-American journalist sitting in the corner. And far away, in a dusty village in Mali, a boy watching on a cracked TV whispered, "That man speaks for us." Trump's voice still echoed in the studio like a gunshot. The lights didn't flicker, but the world felt like it had gone dim. Even the anchors, veterans of 1,000 interviews, sat speechless. The lead host, an American journalist named Clarissa Young, blinked hard, unsure if what just happened was even real. But the cameras kept rolling. Traoré didn't speak immediately. He simply sat there staring. Not at Trump, but at something behind the screen, as if he were looking through time itself. Finally he spoke. His voice wasn't loud, but it was full. "In my country, children are dying. Not because they are lazy, not because we failed, but because some of you treat our land like it's yours to plunder." There was silence. One of the European guests tried to interrupt, but Traoré raised his hand gently. "You call me a bitch, but you forget, I was trained to die for my people. Would you ever do the same?" Tears welled up in Clarissa's eyes. Somewhere in Chicago, an old African immigrant turned up the volume on his TV and whispered, "Speak, my son." Traoré slowly reached into his jacket pocket. The camera zoomed in, the studio lights glowing against his fingers. He pulled out a folded piece of paper, wrinkled, slightly faded, and covered in handwriting. He looked down at it, took a deep breath, then said, "This letter was written to me by a boy named Musa. He was 12. The audience held their breath. He lived in a village where U.S. and European companies built gold mines. They promised his father jobs, promised schools, promised water. A pause. They brought guns instead, Clarissa whispered off mic. "Oh my God." Musa wrote to me with his final words, "Captain, my brother is gone. Our land is gone. I don't want to hate. I just want to live." He held up the letter with trembling fingers. He died the next day. Malaria, no medicine. But billions were made under his feet. Trump shifted in his chair. The room had become something else now. No longer a debate. It was a mirror, a trial. And suddenly, people started listening. All around the world, viewers sat forward, and some began to cry. Trump had started the debate with a grin. A showman's grin. But now, he looked different. He leaned back slightly, blinked more than usual. The redness in his face wasn't anger anymore, and it was discomfort. Clarissa turned to him, finally finding her voice. "Mr. Trump, do you have anything to say about what Captain Traoré just shared?" He fumbled with his notes. I don't know that story. I think we've done a lot of good things in Africa. More than anyone." The audience didn't clap. Not a sound. Traoré responded softly, "Good things don't erase graves." The screen behind them flashed with images, photos of destroyed villages, sick children, stolen resources. "You told me to sit down," Traoré said, "but I'm standing for them." Clarissa covered her mouth. One of the crew members behind the camera wiped away tears. In a refugee camp in Niger, dozens of children watched on a donated TV screen, and one little girl stood up and said, "He is not afraid. He is us." In the control room above the glowing studio, the producers were panicking. "Should we cut the feed?" one asked. "No," the director whispered. "This is history." The panel sat frozen. Ibrahim Traoré sat taller now. His voice hadn't gotten louder, but his words carried a weight that shook the world. Every time he spoke, it felt like truth crashing into lies. A screen behind him now displayed the child's letter again. A White House official sitting off camera whispered into a phone, "Trump needs to stop. This is going very badly." But Trump wasn't backing down. He leaned forward and said, "Let me tell you something. Africa doesn't need speeches. It needs help. We've given billions. What have you done?" Traoré slowly turned his head. And then, for the first time, he showed emotion. "I buried 14 children with my own hands, Mr. Trump." Gasps. "They died because medicine meant for them was shipped to the black market. Their village had a drone flying over it before they ever had clean water." The room went silent. Even Trump didn't speak. A storm had come, but not the kind they expected. The debate was being translated live into 22 languages. But at minute 48, the French translator in Paris stopped speaking mid-sentence. Her voice cracked. She turned away from the mic and began to sob quietly. It wasn't just her. A South African reporter watching live tweeted, "I haven't cried in years. This man, this Traoré, is carrying centuries of pain in his voice." Back in the studio, Traoré placed the letter down gently and reached into a folder. This is not just a debate. It's a courtroom. He held up a photograph, an aerial shot of a burned-out school in Burkina Faso. This school was funded by a Western NGO. They said it was built. They sent photos. They cashed millions. He placed a second photo beside it. This is what it looks like today. Ashes. It was never real, just Photoshop and lies. Trump looked stunned. His advisors off stage were texting like mad. The studio host tried to regain control. "Captain, are you accusing international groups of fraud?" Traoré didn't blink. "I'm not accusing, I'm proving." The weight of his voice pressed on the world like a mountain. In a small town in the U.S., an African-American pastor paused his Sunday sermon. He had turned the TV on behind the pulpit. His congregation, young, old, mothers with babies, sat silently, watching the live feed. "That man, he's doing what Martin once did," the pastor whispered. Back in the studio, Trump tried to recover. Okay, he said. "So some mistakes were made, but Africa is corrupt too. You people let this happen." There it was. Traoré exhaled, slowly. Then he looked straight into the camera. "Corruption is a global disease, but don't treat Africa like the only patient." He stood up for the first time. If a man steals food to feed his children, is he the same as a man who steals a nation's wealth and calls it business? The audience didn't move. Traoré's hand was now on his chest. "I speak with wounds, not anger, and I speak not for revenge, but for justice." Suddenly, someone in the live studio audience stood up, a white woman. She put her hand over her heart and whispered, "I'm sorry." And just like that, something began to shift. As Traoré's words echoed through the studio, a woman seated in the second row stood up. She was not a politician, not a journalist, just a school teacher from Ghana who had won a ticket to attend. In her hands she held something, a folded map of Africa. She walked quietly to the edge of the stage and unfolded it. On the map were red circles, villages, towns, forests. "These are places where children died," she said, softly but clearly. The studio didn't stop her. No one dared. She placed the map on the table in front of Trump and whispered, "You know nothing about us." Trump didn't respond. He just stared, maybe for the first time, truly listening. The camera panned back to Traoré. He didn't speak either. He simply stood beside her, then placed Musa's letter on the map. The room became sacred. Far away, in a hospital in Uganda, a nurse stopped her rounds just to watch. She later said, "For the first time, I felt like the world was hearing Africa. Not as a charity case, but as a voice." On social media, the live stream had crossed 1 million live viewers, a number unheard of for a political debate. But this wasn't just politics anymore. This was history. In the Philippines, a radio host began translating Traoré's speech in real time. In Brazil, tears streamed down a woman's face as she whispered in Portuguese, "This man, he carries truth in his bones." Back in the studio, Clarissa, the American anchor, finally found her courage. "Captain Traoré, what do you want from this debate?" He looked straight into the camera. "I want no more lies. I want our resources to stay in our soil. I want the West to stop calling us corrupt while stealing our future. And I want our children to live past the age of 5. A pause. "I don't want pity. I want respect." Even Clarissa's voice cracked as she said, "You've earned it." In the control room, the producer whispered to her assistant, This is the kind of truth that changes the world." Donald Trump sat still, but his fingers were now trembling. Not out of fear, maybe confusion, maybe reflection, maybe regret. His advisors off stage had stopped giving him signals. Even they knew this wasn't his stage anymore. Traoré looked at him and said, "Mr. Trump, I don't hate you, but you've used your power to mock our pain. You shouted at me, but I came here to speak for the voiceless." He leaned closer. The only reason I didn't shout back is because our children are watching. And I want them to know that silence, when filled with truth, is stronger than noise. Trump looked away. His jaw tightened, but he didn't interrupt. One of the cameras zoomed in on his face. His eyes were watery. Clarissa glanced toward him, surprised. A second later, Trump quietly whispered into his mic, "Maybe I was wrong." Gasps. The comment wasn't loud, but it broke the wall. For the first time, even his supporters online paused. The tone had shifted. The world was holding its breath. At exactly 56 minutes into the broadcast, millions of screens across West Africa suddenly went black. The satellite feed dropped. Phones buzzed. People panicked. Was it over? Was Traoré silenced? In the studio, Clarissa's earpiece buzzed. Uplink interference in multiple African regions. Traoré didn't react. He simply adjusted his mic and said, "If they silence the screen, let them know. Truth has already entered the heart." A moment later, one brave station in Senegal reconnected the stream using backup satellites. Thousands cheered. In Nigeria, a woman burst into tears. "They tried to shut him down, but they can't shut down what we feel." Clarissa whispered, "Captain, do you want to continue?" Traoré nodded slowly. "I was trained as a soldier. I saw men die just for speaking up. I'm still here. So I will speak." And he did. What followed were words that would soon be carved into protest banners, stitched into classroom walls, and repeated by generations. Traoré looked around the studio. He picked up a white folder labeled Foreign Aid Agreements. "This is the truth," he said, holding it up. "Most of this aid isn't aid. It's a leash." He opened it and read from a contract. In 2021, Burkina Faso received $200 million in U.S. assistance, but 92% was paid to American contractors. Only 8% reached our soil. The room went still. "They send rice, but buy it from American farms, not ours. They build schools, but hire foreign workers. Then they call us dependent." Clarissa bit her lip. Trump tried to interject. "Foreign aid saves lives." But Traoré turned to him calmly. "Then why are children still dying?" He held up another picture, a mother weeping beside an empty water well. This woman walked 13 kilometers every day for clean water. 3 weeks after this photo, she died. Aid came, but not for her. The camera zoomed in on his eyes. No rage, just pain. And millions watching around the world suddenly began to question everything they had ever been told. Traoré paused. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small photograph. "This is Adamu, age 7, from Kaya." He held it up to the camera. He wore the same yellow shirt every day, torn at the neck. He always smiled, even when hungry, even when sick. The studio watched, breathless. He used to wait outside the army camp, not for food, but for books. One day, I gave him one. He looked away for a second. His voice cracked. 2 days later, he stepped on a mine planted by militants targeting our soldiers. The audience gasped. Clarissa's hand went to her mouth. He died holding the book I gave him. He held it up, a tiny blood-stained notebook with faded French writing. He wanted to be a doctor. Instead, he became a statistic. At that moment, the panel was no longer a panel. It was a memorial, a confession, a call to the soul. And far away in villages across the Sahel, people stood silently in front of flickering screens and wept. After the story of Adamu, the boy in the yellow shirt, the entire studio went completely silent. Even the lights seemed dimmer now. Donald Trump, who once sat like a giant at the center of power, now looked small. He wiped his forehead, leaned forward, and did something no one expected. "I didn't know," he said. His voice trembled. "I didn't know it was this bad." Clarissa looked at him, stunned. She asked, "If you did know, Would you have cared? Trump didn't answer, but Traoré stepped in, not with anger, but mercy. We don't want your guilt. We want your ears, your respect, your honesty. He reached out, not for a handshake, but for understanding. You can mock me, curse me, but you cannot ignore me, not anymore. The studio audience rose, not in protest, but in solidarity. One by one, world leaders, journalists, and even Trump's supporters realized this wasn't a debate anymore. It was a reckoning. Live viewership soared to 92 million. All across the world, from Paris to Lagos, from small Ghanaian villages to New York subways, people were watching. But it wasn't what Traoré said next that moved the world. It was what he did. He reached into his jacket, pulled out a small hand-woven Burkina Faso flag, and placed it on the table. Then he removed his military beret, placed it gently beside the flag, and said, "I am a soldier, but I don't want war. I want dignity." He bowed his head for a moment of silence. For Adamu, for Musa, for all the invisible names buried in the dust of forgotten countries. And then, a single tear slid down his face. He didn't wipe it. He let the world see it. That one tear became the symbol of millions. Clarissa couldn't speak. The camera zoomed in, then slowly pulled back to capture the entire stage, a leader with no armor, and a truth that shook the planet. The final seconds of the broadcast arrived. The host looked at Captain Traoré and asked, "If you had one last thing to say to the world watching, what would it be?" He lifted his eyes, voice barely above a whisper. "Stop helping us from above. Stand beside us. Listen to our truth. We don't want pity. We want a seat at the table, not because we are weak, but because we are worthy." He placed his hand back on Adamu's notebook and said, "I speak for the child with no microphone." And then, the screen faded to black. If this story touched your heart, if you cried, if you paused, if you saw yourself in any part of this, then do what matters. Like this video, not for me, but for every child like Adamu. Subscribe to this channel, because we're telling stories the world is too scared to show. And most of all, drop a comment. Let the world know you were here, that you heard this, that you'll never forget it. Tell me in the comments, what part of this story made you cry the most? Let's talk, let's feel, let's rise.